panel of QuaranCon 2020, the fantasy convention for staying the F at home. So we are all practicing social distancing and coming to you from between Canada, England, and America. So hello, or the United States, I should say. We have in QuaranCon 2020, we've had a fantastic weekend so far of great panels and readings, and I encourage you to go to QuaranCon2020.com and to view them if you've missed them, but there are more panels to come today and tomorrow, so the fun continues. We also want you to go to Artists Alley on that website, and there you can check out a lot of artists and authors and artists and their work that is for sale, just as if you were at an actual book con. So with that, I want to get into today's panel. We're here to talk about gender identity, and gender roles in science fiction and fantasy, and how they've evolved, and what we can take away from that for in terms of our interpretation of our own world. So along those lines, the last few years have seen a more rounded understanding of gender in our society, and SFF work looks at different worlds and different times where gender isn't necessarily bound by our traditional notions. So our panelists today want to explore those topics. And we have with us Angela Ward, Madeline Dyer, A.K. Faulkner, and A.F. Stewart, who goes by Anita. And I'm going to ask each person to tell us about themselves, starting with A.K. Faulkner. So.
Hello, I'm A.K. I write urban fantasy. I have a 7-book series out. Publishers Weekly have given it a star. Kirkus love it. Apparently it's all right. That's me. I'm stuck here in London. As you can tell, it's very sunny. All
right. And how about Angela? You go ahead.
I'm Angela Ward, and I write epic fantasy. I only have one book out right now, which is Fortune's Fool. It's a finalist in the self-published fantasy blog off SPFBO right now, which is almost done. It only has like 3 more days, and so we're all kind of watching all the scores come in at the last minute. And but anyway, so this is the first. It's the first book in a. It's probably going to be about a 4-book series, I think, and I'm working on the other ones. So that's me.
Okay, Madeline, how about tell us about yourself?
Hi, so I'm Madeline. I write dystopian fiction and fantasy for young adults, and I've got 7 books out. My debut is Untamed, and that won the 2027 SIBA Award for Best Dystopian Novel.
Awesome, congratulations. Yeah. And finally, Anita, how about you? Tell us about yourself.
Okay, I'm Anita Stewart. I write under A.F. Stewart. I write fantasy and horror, and this is my latest horror fantasy story collection, and I'm from Canada. So
all right. And lastly, I'm Amanda Justice. I write science fantasy. The one book I have out right now is called A Wizard's Forge, and it is a lost space colony, dark fantasy, sci-fi blend. So with that, I wanted to launch into today's discussion. I'm a follower of the Otherwise Awards. I don't know if anyone else in the panel is familiar with that, but it used to be called the James Tiptree Award. And it's a annual award. They actually have fellowships, and they have awards every year that they give to literature that explores gender identity or gender roles in speculative fiction. And so I think they do great work, and this award is something that is, and they bring the issue to the fore. But it started based on an author who was a woman who wrote under the pseudonym James Tiptree back in the 1960s and 70s. And I wanted to start off with the panel to talk about like what classic science fiction and fantasy might have inspired you or influenced your work, going back to older, more classic titles that presented gender in a new way to you when you were younger. So I'll just take a volunteer, whoever might want to speak to that first, if anybody.
I mean,
I'll go.
I was going to say, we're all going to say Left Hand of Darkness, aren't we?
Yeah, we are.
Well, that is the obvious one.
Yes, yes, it is. But, you know, I wonder, since you all brought it up, Left Hand of Darkness has been criticized for presenting a really binary view of gender. And I wonder, you know, back in the 1960s when Ursula Le Guin wrote it, that was probably, it was a revolutionary idea to have a non-gendered species in the first place. But the fact that then, you know, over the years, the fact that she actually did make that species choose between male and female was, you know, in their reproductive cycles, was something that has been criticized. So I wonder, AK, if you, or Anita, either one of you, if you want to talk to that.
Anita,
Do you have any thoughts on it?
Well, I mean, I can see the criticism because, yeah, she kind of, maybe you could say that she sort of like went with the idea only so far. But then again, you know, you got to go with the times too. So it's sort of, it's hindsight is what 2020 or whatever that saying is. So
yeah, I think it's quite interesting in that, considering like Ursula K. Le Guin's father was an anthropologist, I believe, and so this is where she got all this exploration of gender from, but they were still rooted in this idea that gender is a binary, and there are several cultures on Earth which historically and in the present day don't believe that to be true. And I think at some point we also need to unpick gender from sex, because I mean, for example, the same number of people are born red-headed as are born intersex. But due to the amount of non-consensual operations on intersex babies, we tend to enforce a gender on them before they're even old enough to know that they were born intersex. And many intersex people find out they were born intersex at a much later date when they see a brand new doctor who said, "Did you know you've got ovaries?" Or, you know. And so I think for a book that was written in the 60s, I think that's an understanding that wasn't present at the time. So yeah, it is a hindsight is 2020 thing. We can criticize it now and go, well, you still adhered to the gender binary, didn't you? But I don't think, because Ursula K. Le Guin herself was not the anthropologist. So
I think they're also, it, whether or not she was aware of other non-binary genders at the time she wrote it, I think there was also a deliberate choice. If you read that book, the whole thing is about opposites.
yes.
And so the notion of opposites is explored on every level throughout the entire book. So in a way, I think she kind of had to choose a binary.
Yeah, like there's only two countries and they're exactly opposite. You know, it's
exactly
the whole thing.
The whole thing, the light and the dark, and the volcanoes and the ice in the one section of the novel. So so to me it works very well. There was an episode of Star Trek Next Generation in the 1990s where they encounter a species of people who have no gender at all, and then sort of like in a Born This Way kind of theme, Riker falls in love with one of them who actually identifies as a woman and is ostracized in her society for it. So I just recently resaw that episode, so it was very much on my mind.
Yes.
Anyhow, so Madeline or Angela, do you have any thoughts on, you know, we don't have to talk about Left Hand of Darkness, but any other works that inspired you when you were younger in terms of their depiction of either gender in general or women or what have you? So
I have to say The Handmaid's Tale, because it's just an amazing feminist story, and like reading about the horrific things that these women are enduring and the divide between the male and female roles is what really made me understand that so much of the impact that a book has is bound up in the interaction that the fictional society has with the real world. And it's really sort of about what the reader takes from it, and sort of the parallels that they can then sort of draw up between this fictional society that's really like created to be bad, so that we know it is wrong, but then we're still finding things in like our world that still link into this, like the gender roles that presented in such a horrific way. So yeah, that's a book that really made me think about gender norms and roles in current society.
I'd just like to point out my eye roll was at the exhaust farting past of some teenager with his sports car. It wasn't you.
And Angela, how about you?
Well, I read, the one that I remember the most is Robin McKinley's books, The Blue Sword and The Hero and the Crown, which I grew up in the 80s, and those, I read those when I was, I don't know, 11 or 12. And, you know, at the time they were kind of getting into the girl is, it was like the girl who wants to be a boy kind of thing, but it was always like, that's what she did. But Rob McKinley's was a fuller exploration of that. And you had Erin in The Hero and the Crown, who, you know, she had the sword, she had all this stuff, but she also had the romance. So it was like she had a bigger role. It was not that she had to be one or the other. She didn't have to become, you know, something other than who she was. She kind of grew into herself, and it was kind of about growing up. And, you know, I was growing up at that time, and Erin was she was a role model for me, I think. And I think those books, you know, I tend to forget plot a lot after I read, but I remember the characters, and those characters, her characters, Harry in The Blue Sword and Erin in The Hero and the Crown, really influenced me as I grew up and then started writing myself.
I think that's kind of my approach to it, because, you know, I am a cisgendered person, so it I definitely identified with the we all hate this term, the strong female protagonist, but when I was growing up and reading and stuff, that definitely had a huge influence on me and my likes and dislikes. And I liked seeing girls and women in those roles of taking the lead in stories, no matter what type of presentation however it was that the story presented them. And so I think it's I'm glad to see that women's roles in fantasy and science fiction have expanded to the point where we can move on past that quote strong female protagonist, and discuss a wider array of gender and gender identities and so forth. So I wonder, you know, are there books currently, the recent books that you guys all admire in terms of how they present gender roles, either for women, if that's, or men, if that's your jam, or you know, the LGBTQ type of protagonist. So I'm going to start with Madeline, because Madeline, you're a YA author, and are there any like YA titles that you think do a particularly great job of doing this and exploring this area?
Yeah, so I'm actually currently reading Mask of Shadows by Lindsay Miller, and the protagonist of that is gender fluid. And it's actually the first YA book I've come across where the narrator is gender fluid, and like it's not like a huge part of the story, so like you still got like this epic fantasy world, and like the main character's training to become an assassin, and it's got like this whole like job interview aspect as well, because they want to be the queen's assassin. So it's very like, although they're gender fluid, it's not like the book isn't all about that. It's just sort of like this accepted by the world, and it's not really sort of drawn attention to in the way that I think it would be in the current society today. So like this world is very much established where there are gender fluid people, and it's just very much accepted. So I think it's great that like you get these books for young adults in particular that do show these different gender identities, because like the teenage years can be quite difficult anyway, and like if a teenager who is like thinking that they might be gender fluid can see like this role model in this book and who is gender fluid, but the whole book isn't actually about them, and it's still showing that they've got like all these goals, and that it's like really focuses on their like amazing personality and like
Right.
what they want. It's not like specifically about being gender fluid. So I think that's important, where you can have find a book where the main character shares the same gender identity as you, and it's still about something else as well, with like fantasy.
Yeah. AK, you write YA too. So how about yourself?
So I actually write new adult.
Oh, sorry.
Which, that's okay. Which, because you all did it earlier, I'm going to do it now.
Please.
But I find it interesting that we're getting a lot of more diverse genders in young adults specifically. And I think in part it's because Generation Z is historically the queerest gender we've had in modern history. And so finally there is a generation who is, I don't want to say this in horrible marketing terms, but I'm going to say it in horrible marketing terms, a whole generation we can sell stuff to as far as publishers are concerned. Because historically, publishers have been run by men, and they feel that men are the buyers of their books, even though in any genre, women are the more representative customer base, whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, romance, thrillers, crime, whatever. But in young adult, we've got things like Gideon the Ninth, which is about space lesbian necromancers. We've got Once and Future, which has quite a lot of non-binary secondary characters. We've got I'll just take a look. But also there's a lot of indie stuff going on out there that is.
Oh, I think we lost AK. So her feed froze. So while we wait for her, and how about yourself? How about books that you think are doing a good job of representing gender? Gender roles are up for grabs here too.
My recent reading actually has gone down, so I don't have a lot to pull from. But as far as female protagonists, the Children of Blood and Bone, is that it? I think that's the title. That one I've started reading that one, and so far it's been great. And I did like Uprooted by Naomi Novik. That was an excellent female protagonist in that book. So I mean, I'm still kind of branching out into the more fluid gender books, as it were. So I'm not an expert on the recent.
Oh no, and I want to make sure that everybody, because I think that Angela has a fabulous novel with a sort of a more traditional fantasy story of a woman sort of trying to break out of the prescribed.
She's on my reading list too. all the Spiffbo books are on my reading list. I just haven't got to them yet.
Anyway, so Angela, take it away for you. What books have you admired that have been more on the recent side?
On the recent side, I think actually I just finished a short story that's free by Quimby Olson. And I want to say it's called The Slumbering Fire, but I'm not actually sure of that title. But I'll have to give it to you later. It's just a short story, and it packs a lot of character development into it. And there's a female relationship in it, but it's about older women. And it's kind of about them finding their place in the world and kind of redefining themselves. And they're just they're characters that you don't really see very often in fantasy. Women are usually like 25 or younger, and you don't usually see them being protagonists and figuring out where they fit and like who they are. And I really enjoy that. She's an excellent writer. So
I think that's a great point. I think we don't have enough, although female protagonists and other representational have come to the fore in literature, and particularly in science fiction and fantasy. You still don't see a lot of stories about older women. And I think particularly in SFF, and if I'm wrong about that, if any commenters want to correct me, please do. But I think that, you know, I have to go in my own reading. I almost have to go back to the Mists of Avalon, and I know that we're not supposed to talk positively about that book anymore, although it was very influential for me. To hear a story that involves a middle-aged protagonist. So in it, I think that a middle-aged female protagonist, that is. So I think that there aren't that many books out there that do that really well. I think that sort of Kaigan, the other SPFBO finalist, does do that really well with a I say middle-aged, but really she's not. She's in her 30s, so that's not very middle-aged. But to have, you know, a mature woman as the protagonist is something that you don't see very often, and it's great. It's really refreshing and great when it does. So I just wanted to throw out there another book that I think does a fantastic job of dealing with characters that are transgender and LGBT, and in this case lesbian characters, is the book called Of Honey and Wildfires. It's a fantasy coming out. It's actually going to be released tomorrow, and Sarah Chorn wrote it, and it is beautifully written, and it also has the three main characters all fall into that LGBTQ representation, and I think that it is something that everybody should check out. So AK is still having some technical difficulties, so I think we're going to move on. Let's talk about men for a little bit, and how the male role in fantasy and science fiction has changed or has not changed. Recently, Philip Pullman caused some controversy on Twitter. There was a little of a kerfuffle on Twitter because Philip Pullman complained about the portrayal of the male characters in Little Women. And he sort of, you know, talked about them being weaklings, or I don't remember his exact words. But anyway, there was a little kerfuffle about that. And I think that it did remind me that I think while we're seeing a greater breadth of portraits of women and gay and lesbian characters and transgender characters and everything in speculative fiction, I feel like there's still not a lot of room for the quote sensitive male to step forward and be a legitimate protagonist. So I don't know if anyone agrees with me on that, but I wanted to get your guys' views on this topic. So what are male characters? What, you know, how in the framework of science fiction and fantasy, how can we broaden or should we try to broaden their portraits?
Yeah, we should. there's way too many the alpha male characters. I mean, really, it's gotten to the point where it's almost a stereotype now. Mm-hmm. I mean, for heaven's sakes, men in real life have feelings. I mean, maybe they show them differently than women and stuff and whatever, but you know, they do actually feel.
Yes.
So, I mean, why don't the characters? I mean, really, it's ridiculous. I mean, if you want a good character, they have to be well-rounded. Plain and simple.
She's back. Yay.
We can't have well-rounded male characters. Then they'll be like feeling things, and you know, they won't just be punching the bad guys and
bunch of pussies. Come on. Which brings me to a whole other topic of why insults referring to the female anatomy are weak. In the middle
of my rant about.
Anyway, Angela, do you have any thoughts on this? Because I know you had mentioned you're happy to see a question about men and this.
Oh, right, because I totally agree with Anita, because it's you know, it's like they don't have emotions, but they do. I mean, you know, men in real life, they have emotions, and they don't have to be like, I mean, that's that's saying that men, you know, like who love their kids or, you know, good parents or are sad when their friends die are weak somehow, and that's ridiculous. So, and they don't have to be shown as like milk toast is like I don't know, it makes me think of like Walter Mitty or something, but you know, like they can be very male identifying, like as we think about men, you know, being and still have emotions, and it's actually what I was hoping to do. I like doing that when I write too, but trying to show men as being, you know, like actual human beings.
Right. I think it is something. It's some time. I still feel like it's kind of like an oddball if you do have a male character in your work that's not a sword wielding brute. And if you have like someone who's scholarly or artistic and that's their thing, versus just the fighter. And so I'd love to see a greater range of that appear in literature. So Madeline, you're nodding, so let me hear from you on.
Yeah, so I'm like really sort of interested in looking at how gender roles, like the traditional gender roles, can be subverted. So in my book, here it is, The Curse of the Winged Wight, I really looked at sort of subverting gender roles and challenging gender expectations. So the prince in the story is quite weak by traditional standards, and he's not the one who saves the day. And instead it's very much about the independent female characters, and there's a female ogre in the story who's like really prominent. And like usually like whenever I've seen ogres in stories before, it's always like they're male, whereas it's like a female one. So like I think it is important to sort of challenge readers' expectations as to when they see sort of like a character who stereotypically should be one thing, that you then like make them think that, oh, they're actually their other thing, and that's okay. And I think the more people like the more authors that write these sensitive male characters who like basically just have emotions, then the more normalized it will become, like seeing these characters in fiction. I mean, I think you can slowly begin to change people's opinions on what an appealing character is. So like, I think that it is possible to make these sensitive male protagonists appealing to male readers as well as females. But I think it's you can't just do it like through like one or two books. It's going to take a while, and like readers need to get used to seeing it more.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yesterday there were a couple of panels on diversity, and the topic of tokenism kept coming up, and I think we can't tokenize our sensitive males. We have to have like more than one in the cast of characters. Otherwise it stands out as the oddball or the oddity that he's not just like, brutish and strong.
He's not the fey artist who's the feminine one who has his
right.
feelings because also he's into painting. Like, no, please, no.
yes, exactly. And that the only males that are allowed to have feelings are gay males. So I think there needs to be a broader representation of that, and sort of those exploration of the dreaded term toxic masculinity, but turning that on its head and talking about how power relationships are established. One book series that I think does a really good job, and it's an independent author, and she's not really well known, but her name is E.P. Clark, and she writes fantasies that are based on a sort of pseudo historical Russia. And she has in her society the gender roles are completely flipped, so that it's completely matriarchal and female power base in those novels. But all of the our stereotypes of women and what makes women weak are in that society what makes women strong, and the ideas of what makes men strong in our world are what the reasons why they use to make men second-class citizens, because men are just dumb brutes who can't, and dumb angry brutes who can't be trusted to make hard decisions because they have no rationale. no ability to reason. So, I think that that's an example where she does an admirable job of showing how any kind of societal oppression of one gender over another ends up doing damage to everybody in the society. So because she's sort of turned the whole thing on its ear. And I think, those are things that I'd like to see more of in fantasy and sci-fi, so that so we're not just stereotyping, and the only quote unquote strong women are the ones who don a sword and go out and fight like men. And I love those stories. It's not, that's not, there's nothing wrong with that. But I also love to see stories where, the strong woman is just, the decision maker and the caretaker. And I think there's an opportunity to explore that as well. So, I wanted to, in terms of where do we all see, where do we want science fiction and fantasy to go in this area, in terms of, where no one has gone before? Where's the room for growth?
I think there's much more room for growth in exploring gender not being a binary. I mean, the thing is, we all, I suspect on both sides of the pond, get taught extremely basic science at school. About physics is actually a lie. So you do your basic, I know my internet connection's unstable. We do your basic science at 13 to 15 or whatever, and then you go off onto further science, and they go, okay, so everything we told you, that was actually wrong, but it was just really simple to get your head in the game. And you're like, okay, so now you're going to teach me the real stuff, right? And yeah. And then you get onto your A levels at 16, and they go, okay, so that was a really simplified view and was basically a lie. And for God's sake, and then you go on to university, and they go, okay, so your A levels fundamentally were a lie. And one of the lies we learn at school is that there are XY and XX, and those are your chromosome sets for a human being. And that's utter nonsense. There are so many different variations of chromosomes available. And your chromosomes also don't define your gender. They just define some sexual characteristics. And so I think I'd like, moving forward, sci-fi and fantasy. I mean, you'd think transhumanism was a genre ripe for this sort of exploration, where you've got cyberpunk and people are downloading their consciousnesses into bodies and uploading them and then downloading them again. And yet they always pick a binary gendered body, almost always. I think you've got to go, as I was trying to say earlier, you've got to go indie for the actual explorations of gender. Like Bogey Takacs, and I apologize if I've got his name wrong, runs these anthologies called Transcendent, about trans and non-binary protagonists in science fiction. And I think we've got a lot of opportunity here to really explore what gender means. I think we've done the groundwork of exploring what being a woman is and what it could be, and what being a man is and what it could be. And I think now we've got the opportunity to move forward and say, and they're not the only options. Instead of, oh, but you've got to be aliens to have a third option. Like, it's just so weird.
Anita, do you have any thoughts on this issue, or where would you like to see things develop?
Well, yeah, I agree with AK that, gender could be explored way more than it is. But also I'd like to see, it kind of just not matter. It's like, the protagonist is the protagonist, whether it's female, male, or something in between, or transgender or whatever. Just, it's a good character. That's all you really need.
Actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that brought up something, a question that I wanted to add, and I forgot to write down. But so here's a question in your own work between you, and I'll give you each of you a chance to answer this. Is your work aspirational in terms of how you present gender roles and gender identities in your own work, or in terms of like the parody that's there, or is it or do your characters more struggle with like kind of like traditional boundaries that we have in our own world? So how does that work? And I'll let you go first, Anita, since you brought up this topic.
Well, and like in my horror writing and my darker fantasy, my female characters, I just don't really have any expectations there, because you know they're just as dangerous, murderous, and vicious as the guys. So yeah, I've been exploring the darker side of the female characters.
Oh no, I think and I think that's a really good point too.
This book here, all the protagonists in the stories are women.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are really, really bad people. And some of them are caught up in circumstances that they have to get out of, but not the traditional like victim characters that you see in a lot of horror. Because that's the one thing in my horror I like to do when I do female characters, is not make them the traditional final girls or the victimized characters. I mean, you know, you have to have a little bit of that sometimes in horror, because, you know, people gotta die.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think, you know, when we're writing, you know, any kind of character that's not a cisgendered heterosexual man, although they should get this too. But I think it's important to have characters who have flaws and faults and aren't perfect, and, you know, aren't just Mary Sue's, because that's representing human beings and you know, and it's okay to have characters that make mistakes. So Madeline, how about you for you know, in your own work, are your characters more struggling with traditional type boundaries, or are they moving on to other types of conflicts? And
so in my latest book, This Vicious Way, the protagonist Inga is an assassin, and she's extremely independent, and I did sort of write it a bit in response to how a lot of like strong female characters in YA fiction are then accused of being too unlikable, because they're not sort of like as submissive as perhaps they're expected to be, and there's like this certain sort of view that a female protagonist in YA should be appealing to readers, and like if she's too independent and too like strong-minded, then she'll just come across as unlikable. So that really motivated me in writing this character, to explore how just how an independent female character, how like she's like, some readers have already described her as being too unfeeling and cold, and that because she doesn't open up about her emotions, and she's choosing to respond to situations with actions rather than like talking things through, which is stereotypically a like feminine ways to talk something through, rather than just like responding with your fists, as that's like presumed to be more of a male trait. But then I was also thinking about how like these female characters who are really strong and independent often criticized for being unlikable because they're sort of like quite emotionless. But if it was a male character who had these same traits, they'd be praised almost as being like mysterious and brooding. So I really looked at that in my latest book. And I also had two female protagonists, like you've got these two strong female characters, rather than it being a male and a female character, because quite often you do get in YA fiction, you'll get like a hero and a heroine. But I've got these two female heroes, and like I don't really want to call them heroines, because that's like it's always the assumption that they're going to be rescued. But there's no one to rescue them. They are like the top status people in this. So.
That is like, that's like my thing. But I want to get Angela and AK in here, so I'm going to let Angela go and talk about her work and how she's set up.
Okay, well, mine, I guess I would say it's complicated, because I have both aspirational and kind of, you know, responding against like norms that would be more historical, because it is historical fantasy, and I did base it on our, you know, cultures in our world, but it's a big world. And so different cultures have different standards for what it means to be, you know, a man or a woman, or, so I kind of played it off. Some of the characters kind of played it off, like Arsenault, who, I didn't want him to be a jerk, like as is the case with a lot of the kind of alpha male, you know, women often in a lot of books fall in love and they're jerks. And I couldn't do the romance like that. Because, but on the other hand, Kira, the female protagonist, often is a jerk. She's not very likable sometimes, and she's prickly, and she's also had horrible things happen to her because she's a woman and she made a really bad decision. And you know, it's kind of like she has to deal with those ideas and still find her own way through them. So it was really important to me that even in a society like that, that didn't really treat her like she meant anything, she was just something to be traded, that she had agency to become the person that she was as a human being, kind of regardless of it. Because for most, I don't know, most of the book, there's 2 different timelines, past and present. And in the present timeline, she is disguised as a man. And so a lot of, through that time, she does act like the stereotypical male character sometimes. And, you know, sometimes that's not exactly what readers expect out of the female protagonist. And other, you know, it kind of comes down to reader preference, I guess. But and on the other hand, I wanted to show the male character as being, you know, having feelings, even though he is like, he kind of has a lot of the stereotypical fantasy hero about him, you know, the mercenary and, you know, the mysterious, but he comes from a different culture too. And they treat women differently in that culture. And so the way they kind of interact with each other kind of shows up some of those differences sometimes.
And AK, how about you?
So I think I'm the only one here potentially that actually writes male protagonists. And they are soft, squishy cinnamon rolls who have feelings and talk about consent and have a wide range of emotions. They're both survivors of sexual abuse. They are, and I basically wanted to explore the sorts of things that normally get put on female characters. Because invariably you will read a fantasy and you'll find the woman in the book, and obviously as either the protagonist or the main secondary character, oh, she's got a history of sexual abuse. Of course she has, because that just happens to women all the time. And I want to challenge the notion that we accept that, but I also want to point out it does happen to men as well. And so, but so almost all the characters are male. There are some female characters, obviously. There's a trans lady, but by and large, they are human beings who have feelings. And so, yeah, I wanted to flip this whole idea that male characters are the strong guys who just go in and punch everything, and then they don't have feelings, and then they get their end away at the end of the day as their reward for doing good stuff. And yeah, so like they don't immediately fix their psychological problems, they go to therapy. Therapy doesn't immediately fix them, and so on. So yeah, I just wanted to be able to present an alternative to the almost standardized idea of men in fantasy.
I wanted to speak up to that because I also in my series, the secondary protagonist is a sensitive guy. That's why I brought that up. And he is an artist. He's not a warrior. He the one time he tries to become a warrior after a tragic event in his life sort of spurs him to take that path. It goes very, very, very wrong for him, and it was a big mistake and causes all sorts of trouble. And then as a result, the female protagonist then has to go and rescue him. So it flips the whole like paradigm of the, the damsel in distress and the prince rescuing her. In this case, the damsel has to go and rescue the prince. So I also like, exploring those things and flipping those things around. And I also have a female protagonist who, one reviewer who didn't dislike the book called her arrogant, because she is, she definitely falls more into the sort of traditionally male behavioral patterns of only emotion that she shows is anger. And
I was going to say, is she confident in her skills? That sounds
she's
like arrogance.
Extremely, yes, she's extremely confident in her skills, and
Moves and confidence,
and
arrogance.
she is also very angry. So,
that's it. And yeah, like my sensitive, compassionate, kind guy is the warrior. And the guy who's a little bit less sensitive and compassionate, he's a florist by trade. So,
well, I think it takes a rational mind to arrange flowers properly. So I'm pretty bad at it myself. In my house, I have to say, whenever, when my husband makes the bed and puts the pillows on the bed, he can arrange them so much more nicely than I can. I don't know what it is, but he's just got the touch.
Skills.
It's terrible when I do it. So,
is he for hire?
No.
Can we borrow him?
Yeah, I know. He's also a neatnik. So I tell people it's like living with Felix Unger, for those of you old enough to remember The Odd Couple. But anyway, so I think we're just, we can take your questions on the, if anybody has any, on the chat. But so far, our listeners have been pretty quiet with the questions. So, what else do you guys see happening? I think, we sort of abandoned my my question about where's there room for growth. So anybody who hasn't answered that yet, spoken to that, do you want to hop in and have a say on it?
Well, I just think that I hope that the genre becomes a lot more open to and people start writing them, like just characters with greater complexity, like we don't all have the young woman and I wrote one, so that's like, I like them too, but we have like characters of all ages and, genders and they get to be who they are. Anita said that too, and you treat them as who they are, and they don't have to be like, I kind of hate it when people use the sword as shorthand for strength. And then you get into the plot and they're not actually that emotionally strong, they're just using that sword. The female might still get rescued a lot, and they're not like, and it's not that the woman doesn't. In my books, I'd like to try to have kind of an equal, I kind of always wanted like an equal rescuing, they rescue each other. And I thought that was much more of an equal partnership and stuff like that. But I just hope we can get beyond it. So like that you could have, a sensitive male character and a sensitive female character, and it's, or a non-binary character or whatever. And they're all shown as being strong in their own ways.
Yeah. We do have a question. So are there any books that have particularly well-rounded male characters? And if you don't mind, I'm gonna actually give my opinion on this one first. And I read a lot more classic SFF than more recent titles, but I think in the Earthsea Chronicles that Ged is probably one of the most well-rounded male characters that I've ever read. He was inspirational to me of how a male character should be written. And also I fell in love with him when I was a teenager. So. and the fourth book in that series actually speaks to Angela's question about showing people just being who they are. So in the fourth book of the series, he and Tanar, the main protagonists of the whole series, are both middle-aged, so they're older, and most of the time in that, or a good chunk of the time in that book, they're just living their lives. There is a conflict going on. There is something, you know, that a problem that they're trying to solve, but a lot of it is just, it's very domestic and sweet and kind of like pastoral in a way that I think that I would like to see more of. So that's how I feel about that. But others of you, you know, well-rounded male characters in science fiction and fantasy.
Well,
Oh, go for it.
I was
Go
gonna
ahead.
say, Andy Peliquin writes good male characters, good female characters across the board. So you can't go wrong picking up any of his series.
Mm-hmm.
I
Okay.
actually think this is something that Joe Abercrombie does very well.
Uh-huh.
If you read his like First Law trilogy and then the other books set in that world, all of his male characters, they've got their own things going on. They've got their own hopes and dreams. They've got their own problems. They've got their own shit going on. And then the plot comes and sweeps them up, but they've still got their lives that they're either trying to get away from or to construct or to just survive in. And I think that every single one of those characters is really nicely rounded out, and they're not all I hit things with a sword. The one guy who is I'm going to hit things with a sword and make my reputation, everyone's just like, oh, you're such a fucking idiot. Honestly, it's not all about hitting things with swords. And yeah, I genuinely think that the characters in there are just, I do like them a lot.
Madeline, how about you?
I think probably Book of Fire by Michelle Kenny. It's a young adult dystopian fantasy book, and the like male characters in it are really like well-rounded, and like Eli, who's the twin brother of the main character, he is deaf, and I thought the representation of having this deaf male character who's still like this really valuable member of the society, and because like he's got this like way with animals and wild creatures, so he's still very much valued. And before, when I've read books that have like characters who are deaf, it's almost like they're sort of presented a bit as a burden to the main character, where they've got to then sort of like compromise because they've got this deaf person with them. But in Book of Fire, Eli's like very much this valuable character, like in his own right, and like he may be deaf, but he's still got all these other qualities, and I really liked him. And like the other like main character as well, Max, who's the best friend of the main character, Talia, like he's just really well-rounded as well. And yeah, just like it's really great representation for like disability.
Mm-hmm.
I just really enjoyed that as like a young adult book, and like it's the first of a trilogy as well. So yeah, I really recommend it.
As I say, I certainly like that about the Magnus Chase the Magnus Chase books, the whole Percy Jackson spin-off, where Magnus, the main character, is a bisexual lad. He's got a gender fluid best friend. He's got his other best friend is a deaf elf, and it's just a really good trilogy. Sadly, it should be a longer series, but it's a really good trilogy. And yeah, the deaf guy is not treated by the group as an impediment. He's treated that way by his family, because elves are all about perfection, and so Hearthstone is less than perfect. But yeah, and even those in YA trilogy are really nicely rounded out. They're very well handled characters.
I want to get that. We just got another question, but I want Angela to have a chance to answer this one, and then we'll go on to the next question.
I just finished reading the Tarot Sequence by Katie Edwards, and The Last Son is the first book in that. And he has two characters that are really, they've made it to my favorite lists now. Rune and he's like a, he's Atlantean, so it's kind of an urban fantasy, and like a heavy duty magic user, and his companion is Brand, who's like his bodyguard, but he's also bonded to him, and they are awesome. I mean, it's kind of their friendship, because they're they're like brothers and friends and a little more than that. And they give each other a hard time, like, you know, guys do. But on the other hand, they are not afraid to say, I'm worried about you, you know, stop doing that. Stop putting yourself in danger. How am I supposed to protect you when you're off running around, getting in trouble? And, you know, it's refreshing to read them and like that. And plus the banter is amazing. But I really like those books.
That sounds awesome.
It's really good.
Awesome. So we have
I
a
think-
question. Oh, let me just get this question in.
Yeah.
Have any of you read Ancillary Justice by Anne Leckie? And if so, what do you think of her representation of gender, sex, and sexuality?
I was going to say, surely we're going to get to ancillary justice at some point.
Take it away.
So, well, I was going to say, I think there's an argument for the fact that in ancillary justice, the ancillary doesn't even understand gender and doesn't care about it. So I think it's actually less than representation. It doesn't matter, it's irrelevant. And so, of course, to some people, gender is hugely important, but to the narrator in ancillary justice, it's not remotely important. And so everyone just gets assigned female pronouns, whether or not they're actually female. And in a way, that's great. And in a way, it's not. Because as we all know, deciding what people's pronouns are is incredibly rude and offensive. But on the other hand, the fact that it doesn't matter to the ancillary is itself quite an interesting exploration of gender. So
Interesting. Can you, for those of us not familiar, can you tell us a little bit about that book and what it's about?
Yeah. So basically, it's, oh God, the dog has now started. Basically, it's about it's a sci-fi. And the ship is sentient and is the Justice, but they're all ancillaries. And so this ancillary is Justice, and Justice is telling you what goes on in the story. And so by and large, everyone, because ancillaries don't care about gender, they just go she, he, they don't really care which is which, and it doesn't matter to them. And it's only if they examine a particular character more closely that they actually figure the gender out as well, and then they might start using the correct pronouns for that person. But yeah, I don't really want to spoil it. But yes, it's definitely worth a read. It's a very good book.
All right. Well, I think
We've got an invasion.
Yes.
Pretty much. I was wondering when that would happen. It's just kind of inevitable.
So I'm getting barked at.
The family. We all have our lives. And speaking of, I think actually we're pretty much at the time when we need to wrap up, but thank everybody on this panel. This is a great panel. I really enjoyed talking to all of you today. It's about a topic that I love to talk about at length. And everybody go to QuaranCon2020.com and check out the remaining panels. If you missed panels from over the weekend, you can still view them. They're all up on YouTube. And check out Artist Alley. And thank you for coming, and enjoy the rest of your social distancing period. So if you can. So stay safe, stay healthy, everybody. Bye.
Bye.